Welcome to the Leading with Vulnerability podcast. I'm your host, Yuma Barnett, and today my guest is Chaplain Erik Alfsen. I've known the chaplain for a while now, back to 175 before I jetted off to Australia. He was a chaplain there for a few years, and then he came up to regiment, was a regimental chaplain. He's been in various other special operations positions overseas as the task force chaplain. I know he's got a great story. He tells a great story. I'm just honored to have him on here as he starts his transition out of the regiment, and we'll get into that. But I'll hand it over to Erik to introduce himself, and then we'll get into the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely, Yuma. Thank you for having me out here, you and Kate, to your beautiful home, and for allowing me to come and be a part of this podcast. I was telling my wife yesterday, this is awesome because it's going to go viral, and then I will have gotten in on the ground floor. So really appreciate it.
So let's take it back. What's your origin story? Where are you from? What were you like as a kid pre-chaplain time?
Okay, yeah, I don't have a great origin story, but I grew up in the Bay Area of California in San Francisco. It's not a lot of Rangers from the Bay Area.
I'm a huge 49ers fan.
Well, the lights from Candlestick could be seen from our windows.
That's
actually,
amazing.
yeah.
I got chills just thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are some great years too in my childhood. Awesome. Back with the Joe Montana, Jerry Rice, Ronnie Lott era. Those some fond memories. Yeah. But my dad was a marine engineer, and that afforded us the opportunity to travel quite a bit, mostly in East Asia. Spent time in Hong Kong and China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. So I got to see a lot of the world as a kid growing up. I had absolutely no idea that one day I would be in the Army. If anything, I thought I wanted to be a naval officer. Couldn't have anticipated this life at all.
Oh, that's amazing. So I've known you for a while. Never knew you were from San Francisco. Didn't know that tie. My first Super Bowl I watched was the Broncos Niners.
Yeah,
and I just kind of latched to them. And everybody else in my family is diehard Cowboys fans or Red. So I'm like a complete opposite. Over there, the San Francisco voice. That's awesome to learn that about you. So I want to ask a couple questions before we go on that aren't on the script, right? So, Marine father.
Marine engineer.
Marine's the primary word. What was it like having a Marine in the house?
No. Marine engineer is in he
Marine, like
merchant marine.
Gotcha.
Yes, yeah. So during the Vietnam War, he worked for Military Sea Lift Command.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so he worked on cargo ships, a whole other world of stuff.
That's a whole other part of conflict. That sometimes we don't realize.
Absolutely.
The support cast that goes on to
Absolutely.
it. You say Marine, I automatically go there because 21 years in the service.
Yeah, no. So if you think of U.S. Transcom being the functional combatant command that controls movement across the globe, and for the Army, the Surface Distribution Command that moves stuff, but that's really what he did. He was the engineer, a chief engineer on 1,000-foot container ship.
Yeah.
But before that, had again deployed to Vietnam multiple times.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting thought. A lot of people think that when you're in the military, only in the military, that's when you grew up kind of a military lifestyle, moving around a lot.
Yeah.
In different places,
seeing lots of places. Yeah. I think maybe my dad's life gave some normalcy to our life, right? Because he would go to work for 6 months and then you come home for 6 months, and sometimes we get to go with him and get to travel or go work somewhere in another country. So
that's a great way to grow up and get fresh perspectives that I'm sure helped you out as you decided to join the Army.
Yeah.
Become a chaplain. What led you down that path? What was your
to be
moment?
A chaplain. Yeah, that's so. At the end of high school, I had taken a year off, and I'd spent a year in kind of a church internship program, really doing mission trips and service trips as a gap year before college, and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And it was in that year that I felt a calling to vocational ministry. I did think I wanted to be a naval officer before that, but that calling to ministry threw a wrench in some things. So I had this great uncle that was a minister. He was the only clergy in our family, and he'd been on the alumni board or something of this very small, obscure Bible college, this undergraduate institution that trained pastors and ministers. So I saw him at this family reunion late that summer, and it was very late in the year, people were getting ready to go to college 3 weeks later. And he said, you should go to Central Bible College in Springfield, Missouri, and I can help, right? And so I applied to the school. I got in. I thought it was a miracle. later I found out that's just how they rolled, right? I mean, if you had a pulse and you could get financial aid, you get into school, right? So I wound up in southern Missouri in the Ozarks. Coming from California, that was quite a culture shift. That was bigger than going to Hong Kong. So
I can imagine.
Yeah, so it's now a part of Evangel University in Springfield, Missouri. But this school had a volunteer service requirement for all students. Okay. So they called it a Christian service requirement, but every student had to spend X amount of hours every semester volunteering somewhere. So it could be an after-school program, local homeless shelter, a church, something like that. And they had various teams that would go out into the community and do and volunteer and do service. So they had one team that would go up to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri on Saturdays, and they would go to the reception. Do you remember going to the AG battalion when you first got to Fort Benning?
Yes.
Right. And so like, it's like the place that they hand you your uniform. Yep. They like shave your head. Yeah. You give you a bunch of shots and you realize like you just made the worst mistake of your life that you can't get out of, you know? Right. So they would go to this reception battalion and they would do this like USO coffee house type ministry. They'd like play some music and do some skits and share a testimony or experience or something like that. So this was my first exposure to the Army. It was like, I need to volunteer somewhere. Yeah. There's a team that goes up to Fort Leonard Wood and does this. And so the on-call duty chaplain for the installation, this guy would come and he would have to supervise this thing that these random college kids were like running for the garrison. It was a ministry of the garrison chaplain's office. So there was a guy who basically volunteered to take it on every weekend instead of leaving it to the on-call duty chaplain. And his name was Chaplain Tom Wheatley. Oh. So Tom Wheatley was a Ranger qualified chaplain. He'd also been the 3rd Ranger Battalion chaplain. He'd also been the Ranger School chaplain. And a lot of Rangers knew him from ARTB because there used to only be one chaplain there. Yep. So Chaplain Wheatley pulled me and another friend of mine in when we were like, juniors in college, invited us to come spend time with them up at Fort Leonard Wood during the week. And he really mentored us towards the chaplaincy. And I think that really he is one of the reasons that I'm here. And certainly for me, I think he was an example of what a chaplain was. And he was really my only example, right? I thought, hey, that's what you do. You get on active duty, you go to Ranger School, and eventually you go to the Ranger Regiment, right? I had another good example, wonderful man and mentor that was my endorser, my church's head chaplain. He'd retired well before I came on active duty, but Chaplain Scott McChrystal, that's Stan McChrystal's brother, former RCO.
Familiar name for those listening.
Right, absolutely. And then Colonel Rob McChrystal, the former 275 commander, it's actually his dad.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So Chaplain McChrystal was my endorser, and he was a prior service infantry officer and was Ranger qualified. So I just assumed like all chaplains should go to Ranger School, right? That made sense to me. So I pastored and worked in civilian ministry in the nonprofit sector for some time after seminary before coming on active duty. And, I remember writing down those 3 preferences, where do you want to go? Instead of locations, we said the 82nd Airborne Division, the 101st Airborne Division, or the 10th Mountain Division. And, got assigned to the 101st and ended up going to 3rd Brigade 101 and spent over 4 years there deploying 2 times to Afghanistan with them.
Well, that's quite a story. And it's funny how the SOF community, we are more intertwined than you will realize because you're saying names there like Wheatley and McChrystal, and it's funny how it's a small community. It's you're going to bump into somebody that or any corner you turn, you never know who you're going to bump into. So as a chaplain, you're coming on the Leading with Vulnerability podcast. Vulnerability is part of what you do. You deal with it. You've been in some vulnerable moments and part of other people's vulnerable moments. So what's your definition of vulnerability? How do you see it?
Yeah, that's a good question that I like that you're asking everybody. And I have to say that I love the title of this podcast. And I like the theme a lot that you're building on. Vulnerability is, as you've already pointed out in your previous episodes, is often confused with weakness, right? And I think in our community that's true. But vulnerability in leadership and relationships, it doesn't mean fragility. Right. It means authenticity. So instead of protecting our image, that we're willing to be real with people, which builds trust, right? And trust is the bedrock. That's the foundation. That's where mission command is built. Mutual trust. That's what we build authenticity through, and the ability to express, to expose in our words and our behavior who we really are and what we genuinely think and feel is a powerful tool.
I agree, and you're right. Our community, we wouldn't readily embrace vulnerability, but we do it inadvertently or subconsciously a lot more than we realize, and it humanizes us, I think, and makes us better leaders.
You're right. And it's going to be more important, I think, even in the future. You know, our team has spent a lot of time thinking and studying generational shifts.
Yeah.
So the Ranger Regiment is an interesting point in history, you know, as we look to the future, but we also recognize generationally that we're kind of at this crossroads where there are three generations of service members in our formation, right? Gen X, Gen Y are millennials, and then Gen Z, right? Our senior leaders are Gen Xers. You know, our sergeants majors, some of our first sergeants, these are Gen Xers. The majority of the formation are millennials, but our youngest Rangers are Gen Z, right? They're the next generation, and most research points to the fact that what they desire more than anything is authenticity, somebody to be real. And I think that we've got to be vulnerable in order to lead them well.
Yeah. To be real and be your true self, you got to be vulnerable. That is true. And then, so moving back into the chaplain portion. So, you know, you think of any, you know, preacher or minister on the civilian side, they go to their congregation, that congregation kind of rallies around them. You know, they're all believers. It's not necessarily that way on the Army side. Sometimes we run and hide, to be honest, when the chaplain's coming to the outstation, you know, and we're a younger population. We're finding our faith. We're, you know, retracting from our faith. We're moving back to our faith. We can be a rough crowd. We're a diverse crowd coming from many backgrounds, denominations. What's it like being a chaplain in SOF? You know, that's got to be, you've got to have some great stories there. Yeah,
probably some that we shouldn't tell for a few more years, right?
Absolutely,
but certainly the best job I've ever had, you know, serving in this organization. 7 years connected to the Ranger Regiment. I had a 1 year gap there at the Command and General Staff College, but I felt like I was really just on sabbatical because I was already coming back to the regiment afterwards, you know. So I would say that the thing that I love about being a Ranger chaplain is that Rangers absolutely value their chaplains and their religious affairs specialists. Yeah. And my credibility as a chaplain in the organization, it didn't come from me. It came from the hard work of chaplains who came before them, right? And so we've often said that we stand on the shoulders of giants, you know, chaplains that you knew, chaplains like Steve Barry, Tom Soljum, Dave Bolus, Mark Winton. Yeah. Those guys built the credibility for us. They created room for us, and they gave us a seat at the table. And that's what being a part of the Ranger Regiment as a chaplain is like. And it's really amazing because everybody here is a Ranger, and this applies to every low density officer in MOS, right? And that's different, I would say, than other soft formations. That's different than Special Forces, and I love Special Forces formations, but it's a different dynamic because their chaplains wear a different color hat, and whether they like it or not, it causes a divide. Yeah. There's the haves and the have-nots.
Literally a different colored hat.
Literally different. Yeah. You know, a story, and this isn't indicative of everybody, but I remember running a ramp ceremony at Bagram for a fallen Green Beret for the Special Operations Task Force, and their chaplain was out doing battlefield circulation, and this service member, this Green Beret, had previously been in the headquarters detachment. So he had a lot of relationships and friendships with non-Green Berets that were in that headquarters formation. So there were a lot of people that were kind of rocked and shaken by this loss. And so the ops sergeant major from that battalion was out there like lining their dudes up and putting them in formation, you know, as we prepared for this ramp ceremony, which is a sacred moment where we carry the remains of our fallen and we place them on the aircraft that's going to take them home and back to the States and back to their family and eventually back to Dover. But I won't forget this, like, ops sergeant major getting out there in front of his formation, tell everybody put their berets on, which we don't normally do because we're on an airfield, right? And that's kind of weird. And then giving the instruction, he said, if you don't have a Green Beret, get to the back of the formation. Oh, yeah. Right? He's like, if you don't have a Green Beret, get to the back of the formation. But the problem was the people that were in the front of the formation had Maroon Berets, and they were the people that knew him.
Closest to him.
They were the people that knew him. They were the people who were affected. They were the ones who were grieving. And so there's this divide, right, between the haves and the have-nots. And I've spent a lot of time deployed with ODAs. I love 18 series leaders, but what I love about the Ranger Regiment is it doesn't matter if you're an 88 Mike or 42 Alpha, right? You are a Ranger. Yeah. Everybody wears a tan beret. And I think that was apparent my first days in the Ranger Regiment, we were doing like an EDRI, with the staff and doing a joint forcible entry exercise. And I realized like, I've got to shoot on this manifest. And I'm like looking at, the SOP, for like a real world scenario. And I realized like, I'm going to jump into combat, like wherever we're going, I don't have to like fight for my seat to get on this thing, and that's awesome. It was also clear to me back then how easy it was to get on target. There may have been places we found ourselves and maybe we didn't need to be, but there was like nobody stopping us from going, because like he's a Ranger, right? He's good. And so we lived through a few gunfights, with some great human beings because of that, because of the access we had.
Yeah. That's great stuff. I just can't imagine sometimes those names you mentioned, those are legends and when I say legendary chaplains, but not some just legendary Rangers.
Absolutely. Legendary Rangers.
Mark Winton is still doing great things, and he married Kate and I, so it's good to think back to those. And I've always had fond memories, mostly of our chaplains, and I know you've enjoyed your last few years in the SOF community.
You're right. It's a privilege. It's a privilege to pastor your heroes, and to care for their families. To care for them and those, and those highs and those lows of their lives. But the answering the question, about being a Ranger chaplain and people being, a challenge. I think the Rangers are a little rough around the edges. We'd be lying if we didn't say that, right? There's a few hoodlums and brigands that make their way through there, right? You learn this by taking single Rangers on like retreats. Like it doesn't matter where you go or how far in the woods you are, they will like walk to find this local strip club, right? Like took some guys on a singles retreat and they like walked like 4.5 miles in the snow on a ski trip to find the strip club in the mountains of North Carolina.
Lies. These are all lies. I've never been to a strip club.
No, nobody has. But
right.
But at the end of the day, as a chaplain here, you're afforded opportunity to share hardship and experience with people, and to walk a mile in their shoes. Bear their burdens and share their joy, and that's been the greatest privilege.
So, what year did you come in the Army?
I came in the Army in 2008.
Okay, so obviously post 9/11. So you came in at kind of a height. Afghanistan was pretty hot at that time. A lot going on. Deployed almost right away to Eastern Afghanistan, and that was a different era, right? Like when a lot of us spent a lot of time thinking about Afghanistan lately, absolutely.
and thinking about that my first 2 years in Afghanistan and remote parts of the country that nobody cared about except for us, and we lived in dirt cops, which were really just district centers, platoons spread across district centers, partnered with, local police or whoever, came in the Army in 2008. And like I said, went to the Rock Sons through 3rd Battalion, 187 Infantry. And, that was those first two deployments were certainly formative for me. And it was certainly a different experience than my later deployments with the task force, as you're located, like I said, in these district centers, these small partner forces, like you really got to experience Afghanistan.
The Afghan experience.
Absolutely. And I don't know that we always understood Afghans, right? Because the gap in culture is massive. The gap in thinking and in values, it's massive. But I certainly was comfortable with them, and I was comfortable being around them, and I sought to understand them. I think that was a lot different when I got here, where we were really good at getting on target, but we didn't necessarily like understand the environment. I remember the first ROD I was on with 175, and I remember like team leader calling up like, hey, there's a bunch of kids over here, like they're coming to watch us and they got a bunch of sheep and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, man, it's Afghanistan in the daylight. Like that's
a Tuesday in Afghanistan.
Like, that's what they do here. They walk around and they look at you.
That's funny. So all that time, all is conflict really. And as we're coming out of conflict, how was it being you had a lot of growing up to do as a chaplain, and you were thrust right into some hard situations, I'm sure. How did that set you up for success as you've carried on your career as a chaplain in the organization?
Yeah, there's certainly some hard days and but some great moments as well, and I think that certainly learned a lot, grew a lot during that time. Like I said, we lived through a few gunfights, but mainly the people you get to do it with, right?
Absolutely.
Just some great human beings.
Absolutely.
Guys that were just calm as a cucumber, right? No excitement in the middle of a crisis. Adam Nash, Master Sergeant Kurt Donaldson, Sergeant Chris Clappin, Josh Peterson, Pat Hartung, Mike Norton, Josh Jacobs. The great privilege was really to be a pastor, like I said, to our heroes, And I think that's what set me up for success. It was building relationships with leaders and NCOs who taught me and who I learned from as I was able to pastor them and their families.
Yeah, that's right. Again, I get chills when you mention those names because I can remember when they were Master Sergeant or Sergeant First Class, and now you got some are regimental sergeant majors, battalion sergeant majors. It's fun to watch people grow through the military.
Yeah,
and just to
that's
be
awesome.
Be part of that it's a gift. It's probably the best way to put it. So all your time in uniform, how's that affected you as not a ranger, but a husband and a father and a leader, and what effects have all those deployments had on your family? Or I know for me, it missed a lot of times, but I also made sure I valued the time that I did have. What some of the stories and perspectives you have?
Effects of all these experiences. In the Chaplain Corps, we say that we have 3 core competencies, and those are nurture the living, care for the wounded, and to honor the fallen. Nurture the living, care for the wounded, and honor the fallen. And I've had the privilege to do all of those in combat and in garrison. For me, it means representing God in times of joy, but also times of sorrow and despair and pain. And from my faith tradition, that means being Jesus with skin on to other people. And this comes from an idea in the New Testament in John 1 where John says that Jesus became flesh and he made his dwelling among us. But then Paul takes this statement in 1 Corinthians 12 and he says, now we are the body of Christ. That what he's saying is we are the talking, walking representation of Jesus for our generation. And I think for me, that's what being a chaplain is. It's offering a humble and respectful and a caring presence, and it means living out my faith, but providing for all faiths, ensuring for the free exercise of religion, and I love that. I love that the opportunity to do that, and it really is a sacred calling, and something that I will cherish for the rest of my life. But there have been crazy moments, there have been some hard days and some good days. Yeah.
I want to dig in a little more on that. So across all faiths, what's that like?
Yeah, well, I this is often something people assume is hard or must be a conflict. Like, you're a Christian minister, how could you provide for everyone? And I think no, this is really, really easy. This makes complete sense to us, right? Because all of us are constitutionalists, right? All of us believe in supporting and defending the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And so part of the Constitution means ensuring that every person in our formation has the ability to practice and to live out their faith and their values. Yeah. And so it doesn't mean that I perform for everyone, because that's disingenuous, right? I'm not a Catholic priest. I can't lead a mass. Right. I'm not an imam. I can't leave Jummah. I can't leave Friday prayers, right? That'd be inauthentic. Right. But I can provide for that person. I can ensure that they have access to the resources that they need or to religious leaders that they need. I can coordinate for them. We can take care of them. We can resource them. And that's really what it means. We can also advise commanders. Absolutely. We provide religious support, but we advise commanders on how to take care of their rangers. So it's really not hard at all. It's pretty easy, and it's rewarding. Yeah. And by ensuring their free exercise of religion, I also ensure my own.
Your own, you're right. That's a great perspective, because I think you're right. I've wondered before how you do it across, but then when I change it, and I just think, when I was a Delta Company first, I'm not a mortarman, I'm not a TSC guy, I'm not a sniper, but I can facilitate and make sure that they had what they needed. I knew where to put myself at points of friction. It's the same thing. It's just you're doing it in a different vein. So
yeah, that's how we minister to them, right? It's by helping meet their needs. And sometimes the need is still a pastoral need. Sometimes it's for presence. Sometimes it's for counseling. Sometimes it's to hold somebody's hand when they're hurt. To be with them in that moment.
That's a great perspective. So being a father, let's talk about what it's like being a father, and what vulnerability with your kids, and How's that? It's not easy being a father in uniform. All the time's gone. And I say all the time, that's not unique. It's if you're a firefighter or a cop or a long haul truck driver, it's hard being a father. What's your thoughts on just being a father?
Yeah, my dad was a good example for me. Like I said, he was gone a lot for work, but he made the time count that he had. Right, he was intentional with the time that he had, and I think whether it's being a father or even being a husband, because I think any success I have in being a dad is because my wife is an awesome mom.
Right,
my wife Christy is, is phenomenal, and by far, like as you'd probably say, right? We married up.
Yeah,
both
absolutely.
of us did, I think, right? We married up, and our wives are our better halves, and so she sets me up for success a lot. But
your wife, I don't know her well, but she's always smiling.
Yeah,
that's the one thing I can always think about when I think about you guys as a couple. I'm like, they seem happy all the time, right? It's a great thing.
She brings a lot of joy.
Yes.
We were talking about this earlier, but it's impossible to balance your life on any given day.
Yeah.
People ask us this a lot, and we talk about it. How do you find work-life balance in the Ranger Regiment? On any given day, it's impossible to balance your life. You're not going to do it, right? Work-life balance is out of reach. But I also believe that this work that we do, this thing that we do, this life that we live, more than a job or a career, it's a lifestyle that we live, right? It's a calling. Now that makes sense for me because I'm a chaplain. That's easy to say. Yeah, it's a calling. God's called us to this. But I think for Rangers in our formation, it's also a calling. It's a calling. Right. And so the Army enlists Rangers. We bring soldiers to Raspman. We create Rangers there, but we re-enlist families.
Yeah.
And that family has to have a shared calling to this life that we live. And for me, I'm blessed that Christy has a shared calling to this ministry. And something Christy says often, she says, if God's called us to this, he's called us to all of this.
Yeah.
And she'll say that when something bad happens, or, we get the late night phone call, or I say, I've got to fly somewhere to do a funeral, or we got to go take care of somebody, or there's a crisis and, something's burning down, or there's a marriage retreat that we got to fix some problem. If God's called us to this, he's called us to all of this. That means there's great perks to being a Ranger. There's some phenomenal parts about the community and about the relationships and about the support networks. Yeah. And it's fun wearing a cool uniform and getting an ops corps issued to you, not having to fight for it when you're a chaplain, and getting to hang out of a C-130 pulling duties, as a drill master. And but there's some hard days too. There's difficulty. Absolutely. And there's hardship, and there's time where my schedule doesn't link up with hers, right? But she says, if God's called us to this, he's called us to all this. So I would say for us, it's balancing your life in the long run,
right?
And something you've said, is it's the pursuit of balance.
Right.
It's striving to balance, and it's having a perspective that goes beyond promotion. I think with my kids, we have to remember that one day we're going to hang this up.
Yep.
One day the Army is going to say no to us. It doesn't matter how much I love the Army or how much I love the Ranger Regiment. One day the Army is going to say no to us. And we have to ask the question, what am I going to have left?
Right.
What am I going to have left? If it's a wall full of plaques, an old uniform in a closet, a drawer full of ribbons and medals, or am I going to have a family that loves me? Am I going to have a marriage that's healthy? Am I going to have children who cherish the memories of their childhood? So something that I try to remind myself is to make a decision for my family that a future me is going to be thankful for.
Absolutely. And that's something I've said before, and I think I talked about it with Dan Ferder on a future episode, but I said, hopefully your wife's your wife for the rest of your life, but your kids, they're definitely yours for the rest of your life. So this time you got to be intentional about your time and make sure you cultivate those relationships with your spouse and your kids. So you probably counsel and talk to a lot of young Rangers that are about to get married or service members. What's one piece of advice you'd give somebody? What's the key to a successful marriage? I know there's a lot, but what's the one thing that you always kind of hang your hat on if you're talking to somebody before they're going to take that leap?
Yeah, you could get me going for 10 hours if we jump into relationship advice here. Here's one that is counterintuitive that I would offer you. If Christy and I write a book on relationships someday, if we ever get around to doing that, our book is going to be based on this idea that you shouldn't be honest about how you feel, right? Okay, here's why. A lot of times, we have this idea in our culture and society that we need to be honest about our feelings. Just tell them everything that you feel. Be honest about your feelings. And for some people, we think that means having a license to be a jerk to our spouse,
Oh,
right?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
With the excuse that I'm just being honest. I'm just
Right.
telling you how I feel. But
Guilty.
But the reality is, like, they don't need to hear all the crazy that goes through our head, right? Like, there are mornings that my wife may look at me and think that she's married a wonderful man. There's other days she may look at me and she's sure she married an idiot, right? But a simple good morning will do. Like, that's okay, right? Yeah. She doesn't need to hear all the crazy that goes through my head. I certainly don't need to see everything that comes out into my head out of my mouth. So I would say use some impulse control in what you say.
Yes, I think you're right. I'll add on to that. You don't have to solve all your wife's problems. Sometimes she's just trying to vent to you.
Absolutely.
And I am the worst if Kate's like, man, I wish I had this or was doing this. And I just give her the list. Oh, we'll do this, this, and this, and you can accomplish that. And she's like, I didn't need you to solve my problem. I just wanted you to listen to me. And
you nailed it.
Yeah. So
yeah, she doesn't. Yeah. She doesn't. How well can you listen?
Yeah, just say, hey, I love you. What can I do to help? Or,
that sounds really hard.
Yeah. Less is more sometimes. And
absolutely.
As being the Ranger NCO, I want to fix everything.
Absolutely.
And sometimes they don't want that. That's right. This is funny. So, in uniform, let's go back a little bit here. What's been your most challenging day since you've worn that U.S. Army, that put that U.S. Army on every day?
Yeah. Yeah, I that's a hard question because I think we've had a lot. But what's interesting about a chaplain's like hardest day in uniform is they weren't really about me. Right. My hardest day in uniform was a moment where I was bearing witness to someone else's pain and hardship. And so we have to remind ourselves of that. We have to create boundaries for ourselves. Yeah. We have to try to remove as much of me as I can from the situation so that I can be present for someone else. So in most of these examples, I was just a witness. I was just there. Lots of stories, lots of examples. Some are personal, some are difficult. Some could probably be triangulated back to quite a few of your listeners, and,
right, absolutely.
Confidentiality, I think is a vital aspect of what we do as chaplains, because, as Ranger Chaplains, like, people got to know they can come and share their stories with us, and they won't leave us. I mean, we know where all the bodies are buried, so I've had a lot of tough days and late calls at home, whether a vehicle crash, a suicide, a training accident, a combat death, right? Those are all hard days. Casualty notifications, those were tough duties where you're walking in to deliver the worst news of somebody's life. You get the phone call that you got to show up to the Casualty Assistance Center with your ASUs, and letting a young mom with 2 babies in diapers know that their dad isn't coming home. Those are hard days. Caring for those who are about to leave this life, is probably the hardest thing to do. And one story that was my first combat loss that probably is representative and typical of many, many more that would come. But my first weeks in Afghanistan, I was down at FOB Sharana. I don't know if you were ever at Sharana.
I spent some time at my Sharana.
Yeah. So we were my battalion headquarters was based out of Sharana. I spent most of the time on the road throughout Paktika and some parts of coast, and that rotation. And again, a typical experience like this, runner from the jock, right? The RTO comes and finds the chaplain, right? Finds me wherever I was, the gym, the DFAC, something, back from battlefield circulation. And I think it was at my little office B hut, plywood hut that my computer was set up in. And he said, hey, sir, they need you in the talk. Right? And so you go in, and the room is kind of silent. It's quiet. Like, people are doing their job. They're watching the screens. There's ISR overhead. They're working a situation. You can tell they're working a medevac. The J3 comes over, the S3 at the, for a conventional battalion comes over and says, yeah, it's not looking good. And in this situation, our distro platoon from this conventional deployment was conducting a resupply mission between Sharana and one of the district centers. And we hadn't been there very long. They're still figuring out the AO. And a pretty typical scenario, but they rolled through a complex ambush. They hit an IED that disabled the vehicle, and they're sitting in the kill zone. And RPG hits the truck commander's door, the TC's door. This predated the time when we had like the bar armor and the netting on the vehicles, and that probably could have changed the outcome that day. But on the other side of that door, that RG-31 was a 21-year-old young man from Oklahoma, and I'd gotten to know him in the months leading up to that deployment, and Sharp kid, fantastic work ethic, huge vision for life. And he'd married his sweetheart just weeks before we deployed. In that RPG-7, when it hits that piece of metal, that it becomes a shaped charge, right? And it shoots a molten jet of copper right through that armor, and cut right through that young man, and causing a pretty brutal injury and evisceration. And so they pushed through the kill zone. They called for the medevac. And after getting the update, I remember going to the forward surgical team that was down the hill, from where our old compound was, and there was that little HLZ pad right there for the medevac birds. I remember the sound of that HA-60 coming in, right? You can remember those rotor blades as they come in pairs, and you could just hear the whomp of those rotors, right? And as they land and as they bring them off, and the FST kind of turns into frantic chaos, and as a chaplain in those especially a tight clinical environment, you got to kind of own your space, right? You got to be present, but not in the way, and so but he stood by watching, hopefully, just praying for a miracle. But after some time, 15 minutes, the lead surgeon, of just everyone working together, working in tandem, but the appearance of chaos of them trying to care for this person, the lead surgeon just puts his hands up, right? And he looks around the room and he says, "Is there anyone here who thinks there's anything else that we can do?" Oh, wow. And the room just goes silence. Yeah. So he turns to me, right? He looks to me and he said, "Chaplain, it's all you." Right. Because he's like, we're done here, and so we prayed, we prayed according to the tenets of that young man's faith, and we committed him to God's hands. And then from there we went to meet the platoon, because they still had to roll back in from the wire, and they didn't know if because he was still verbal when he left. Oh, okay. Right. Oh, wow. He was still talking. And with that type of injury, right, there was going to be some significant hemorrhage, but he was still alive. And so we met with that platoon as they came in and had to deliver that news. And you could see also the hope in their eyes that he'd made it, right, wanting to know how he was, but delivering that news and then caring for them as they went in to say their goodbyes, right? There was more grief with that one, right? That was my very first combat loss, but many more would follow. Some would be harder. Some would be messier. Some would be a lot more complex, right? But all of those are sacred. Yeah. Yeah. So we say their names every day.
Yeah, that's right. You got to say their name there every day, and they will not be forgotten. That's the unique part of your position, right? Anytime we lose somebody, either training or combat or off duty, the chaplain's always part of that conversation at some point. So that's just, I feel for you. We've been there. And so there's another side there, right? You lose the soldier dies, the ranger passes away, and then you have this family that's left behind. And Gold Star families are a huge part of any organization. And you deal a lot with the Gold Star families, whether it's, keeping them updated on events that are coming up, or reaching out to them, or they're reaching out to you. What have you learned from the Gold Star family units and brothers and sisters and moms and dads over the years?
Since 1974, 143 Rangers have laid down their lives in training and in combat. I think as an organization, we have shouldered more than our share of the task when we consider those losses for their country, and that's been really one of the greatest privileges of this job, is to care for these families. As we said, nurture the living, care for the wounded, but honor the fallen. So caring for Gold Star families is one of the ways that we honor our fallen. And I think it's actually unique to the Ranger Regiment. I think, unfortunately, just because of the nature of the Army and the turnover of leaders and the turnover of NCOs and conventional units, it's very hard for them to maintain connections with their fallen, because there's no one that's left around that knows them. But with those 143 Rangers, despite the years, the Ranger Regiment maintains a relationship. They maintain a contact. They become a part of our organizational family. And of those 143, I've known some of them personally. Right. I've buried them, but I've had the privilege to know many of those families, for the ones that I wasn't here for. We've gotten to know their families, and the regiment's special because we know these families, and most units don't. But it's really ingrained in the culture of the Ranger Regiment. The idea, of the airborne ranger in the sky.
Right.
This idea that we can teach our young rangers what sacrifice means by getting them to learn the stories of those who have sacrificed. When we deploy to combat, right before we deploy, we pull out those wristbands, right, and we entrust them to a ranger to carry that wristband into combat, that KIA bracelet, and in so doing, we are carrying that person with us to combat. They are also accompanying us. We take their memories with us. And so this idea of the airborne ranger in the sky is really ingrained into the culture of the organization. And the sacrifice doesn't just belong to their families. It's carried by by the ranger, but it's carried by their families, right? That cost is high. These few people know what it feels like to lose a husband or a son or a daughter, laid down their lives in service to their nation. But our Gold Star families in the Ranger Regiment, they are incredible examples of grace and strength. I think that's what I've learned from them. Is from their grief and from their sorrow, they find hope, they find meaning, and they serve as a source of inspiration. Colonel Brown's often said that the current RCO has said that our Gold Star families are national treasures.
Yes.
Right? They know the true cost of freedom.
Yeah. It's something that we can't lose sight of, and it's great that we have the people like you to make sure that we, as an organization, don't lose sight, because sometimes we get bogged down with kind of the tyranny of the now, and it's good to always recenter and remind us when we have somebody visiting or when somebody's coming by, and just keep those relationships. And again, it's just speaking their name every day, of their loved one that they lost. So you're coming out. You're leaving the 75th.
I am. Yeah.
You've been here for a minute. Are you ready to leave? Has it sunk in at all that you're leaving?
That's the hard part about being an officer here, I think, right? Is that everybody's got to leave, right? Eventually, got to move on and do something else, and so I certainly would have stayed here forever if that was an option that was on the table. So it's hard to leave your tribe. Yeah, it's hard to leave the people that you've loved and that you've served with for so long. But I'm mainly grateful for the opportunity that we've had to have been here.
Yeah. What's one of your key takeaways from the regiment? What are you gonna? You're gonna carry it with you, military life and post-military life. Yeah.
I think we need to. One thing I'll take with me, is remember who you are. Remember who you are, and remember whose you are. As we think about the Ranger Regiment in the future, there's an ongoing debate about what that will look like and what we need to be. And we're having some great discussions, right? Fantastic operating concepts that are being published. But at the end of the day, like we remember what our charter is and why we exist to make the Army better, right? That we serve as examples to others, and when we got to live that out. Something I appreciate that the old NCOs, the old Ranger NCOs, probably like you, but like young guys need to get also the old message we used to often say that you don't wear the scroll, you bear the scroll, right? You don't wear the scroll, you bear the scroll. And part of that's because you don't own it. Right. It doesn't belong to you.
That's right.
You're a steward of this thing, for a very short amount of time. You're an interim, as we'd say in ministry. You're the interim pastor. You don't get to be there forever, Right. And so we are only stewards. We get to take care of it for a short amount of time. And we remember what this thing means. When you look at that Ranger School, when you look at that Tambouret, when you look at the DUI, you remember that it has meaning far greater than just to the Ranger Regiment. Yeah. And so even the one that's on your right shoulder, you got to take care of that thing. Absolutely. You can't dust it up. Yeah. And that's significant to me. Yeah. I was we were talking before, but a few years ago, when I was at CGSE, I got into this like scholars program that basically we just did a bunch of archival research, and I wrote a bunch of things nobody will ever read on like defense support of civil authorities and early 20th century case studies. But one trip we were up at Carlisle Barracks, where the War College is, and there's a big archive there. And at AHEC, at this archive, they've got all of the records of all the chiefs of staff of the U.S. Army. Right. And so I had some extra time, and I was done with my my work for the day. And so I asked if I could pull General Abrams papers, and take a look. And one of the archivists there was very, very familiar. They actually had him out because they were doing some work for General Milley that involved some of this. And so they had some of it out, and they were showing me some of his papers. What I was hoping is I was going to find like the document where he like hand wrote the charter, what I found is that he wasn't an awesome note taker. He just kind of like scribbled stuff, on the bottoms of papers. But Abe Abrams is an interesting guy. Yeah. He's an interesting guy because what we have to acknowledge is like this guy wasn't like an airborne ranger, right? This guy was kind of an overweight tanker. He's like an armor officer with strappy boots, that was a little like on the portlier side in the later times of life, right? And he was kind of like a middle of the road officer at West Point, like graduating like the bottom half of his class. But World War II gave him opportunity, and he went on to be a fantastic armor officer. In fact, Patton, who's pretty big on himself, said that Abrams was his peer when it came to tank officers. Oh, wow. Just as a colonel. Yeah, it's from Patton. Absolutely. He says that Abrams the best. He said he was his. There was one other guy who was better, and he said it was Abe Abrams, right? But Abrams goes on to work on a bunch of people's staffs over the years. Korean War, he was a staff officer. Worked on a bunch of people's staffs, but he was a good officer and he was a good leader. And he inherits Vietnam from Westmoreland. And he gets to Vietnam at the height of our involvement, but it's a train wreck. Stuff is burning down around him. He inherits the My Lai massacre. Yeah. And if there's one thing that's clear about Abrams is that he loved the Army. He absolutely loved the U.S. Army. He loved its people. He loved what it did. And here you find Abe Abrams at this point where he'd been in the Army at the height of its national popularity, of its credibility and trust to the American people. And then here he is inheriting Vietnam and its failed strategies and having to figure this mess out.
What a paradigm shift for him.
Absolutely. And get us out of there, right? And try not to abandon everything that had been done, like try to give more time to the strategies that have been applied, but also figure some new stuff out and how to get us out, right? And so he got drew down forces from the height of our involvement to almost out of the country, and then from there he leaves Vietnam and he replaces Westmoreland again as the chief of staff of the Army. And now he's told like, hey, thanks for coming, but you also need to build an all volunteer force, no more draft. So figure that out.
Yeah, good
right.
Luck.
Yeah, good luck. Right. And so what's in Abrams' files are these like daily briefs that he used to get on like just the disaster of the Army, right? Just like drugs in the barracks in Stuttgart, criminal activity. If you think like the Fort Hood stuff is difficult, like
coming out of Vietnam, it was ugly.
Absolutely. Back to you hear the stories of officers afraid to go in the barracks because of like criminal activity. Like that's what he's dealing with. And he's trying to build an all volunteer force, and he's lost the trust of the American people. And I think through this, like he'd experienced, injury, like he was hurt by what he's watching, and he knows that he's the steward of the Army. And at the bottom of one of these sheets of paper where they're talking about this just disastrous, like, criminal activity in the Army and lack of discipline, he wrote like Rangers. And maybe that was the moment, maybe it wasn't.
And you saw this.
Yeah, it's in there. It's in AHEX files, right? And so maybe that was the moment, or maybe it was a part of a discussion, right? But somewhere in there, he has this idea. And we have to acknowledge, like, what Abe Abrams wasn't doing was trying to establish a special operations raid force.
Right.
Right. That's not the point.
He just wanted some discipline.
He wanted an example to the rest of the Army. He wanted someone for everybody to look at, to serve as an example of who we should be and what we should all strive to be. Right. And so he establishes this idea or this charter for a Ranger battalion, that the battalion is to be an elite light and most proficient infantry in the world that can do things with its hands and weapons better than anyone. A battalion that contains no hoodlums and brigands. Right. And if it's formed of such persons, it'll be disbanded. And he said, wherever it goes, it must be apparent that it's the best. Right. And that is the point. I think that's the crux, that it's got to be the best because it's got to mean something to everyone else in the Army. And there's also some like narrative that says that the idea for the creed also came from Abrams. Certainly Sergeant Major Gentry is responsible for putting it together as the author, but it was Abrams who had an idea for a vision for a Ranger creed. In fact, when General Dupuy, who's the father of Tradoc, came down to Fort Benning to talk to Casey Lure, who was the first 175 commander, and kind of pitched the idea. He told them, Abe wants you to create a creed, and it's going to serve as a guiding light for Rangers to train and fight and live by. And that's powerful, right?
Absolutely.
Because that creed, it ain't a poem, as General McChrystal used to say, right? It ain't a poem, right? That means something to us. Sometimes it's inspirational.
Right.
Sometimes it inspires me. Sometimes it's aspirational. It challenges me to live up to something. But if nothing else, it is a confession.
Yeah.
It's a symbol of who we are as Rangers, and our culture is embodied by it. So in the future, I think we need to be what our nation needs us to be, but we need to be an example.
Right.
We need to be an agent of change that brings other people up.
Absolutely. I think that's great. That's a great history lesson there. I didn't know all of that. That's awesome. If you just go a little bit the extra mile, you can find out some amazing things about, where we came from as an organization and just people in general. So let's talk about where you came from, right? If we could go back all the way to Lieutenant Alfsen, right? And this is just as if you're talking to yourself, but to any, new coming into the Army chaplain, what advice would you give them to set them up for success?
If I could go back and give myself advice, what would that be? I think the first one I would say is that stupid haircuts don't actually make you squared away, right? I had some terrible haircuts. Like if you look at my first pictures of my years in the Army, like terrible high and tights. In fact, that's one thing I think that we gave the Army as an organization, that like, what were we thinking, was the high and tight, and then we got rid of it as a big joke on everybody else, But what I would actually say, I think, is that it'll buff.
Right.
That's the advice. Look it in the rearview mirror, like it'll buff. Now, whatever you were worried about at the time, whatever you thought was on fire, like it ain't that bad, right? It'll buff. It's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I think that we spend so much time worrying about things that don't ever happen. And there was an author and a Holocaust survivor named Corrie ten Boom, and she said, "Worry doesn't empty tomorrow of its sorrows; it empties today of its strength."
Yeah, wow.
And I think that we spend time worrying about things that we don't need to worry about.
Absolutely.
And there's so many examples that I've had over the years of leaders in this organization. Like I said, they're just like calm under pressure.
Yeah.
Like you had Josh Jacobs on the podcast not long ago, and like, listen, man, when there's a gunfight, like that guy, there's nobody you want to be in the middle of a firefight with.
Right.
Or than Josh Jacobs, like he is as calm as can be. Like you hear him on the net, and there's like machine guns going off in the background, like stuff is exploding, and you would think like he's just sipping a cup of coffee at Starbucks, like
That's right.
in the middle of all this, right? Just no excitement, like that. Whatever it is that you're worried about, like it's gonna buff out.
Right.
It's gonna be okay. We're gonna get through this.
Oh man, that's awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on here. I think sometimes it might be more comfortable, but thank you for your service, not only to, the regiment, our nation, our Gold Star families. You've been an integral part of the 75th for the last, how many years? What's your total year count?
6 years in the Ranger Regiment, 4 years at 175, and then the last 2 years here. Yeah.
Everybody knows you. Everybody loves you. Your family, we're going to miss you. We'll wish you the best of luck in your future journeys. And for all of you out there listening, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And be sure to give us your feedback. And again, I just thank you. And good luck in the next phase.
Thanks, Yuma. We appreciate it.